Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study held at St. John the Evangelist in Jackson, Michigan. Thank you for joining us as we walk our way through the process of studying sacred Scripture while we take a deep dive into the Old Testament book of Exodus. I'm your host, Todd Gale. Strap yourself in for a long, prayerful trip. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the 7th session. We will spend a huge chunk of time in the Word today. A chunk of time in the Word, that doesn't quite sound right, but in a longer section of the Word. I won't go into much of the critical study issue in this session. Today we'll be finishing up with chapter 4 and then all of chapter 5, believe it or not. So let's start with a prayer for forgiveness of sins by St. Gemma. Prayer for forgiveness of sins by St. Gemma. My Jesus, I place all my sins before you. In my estimation, they do not deserve pardon, but I ask you to close your eyes to my want of merit and open them to your infinite merit. Since you willed to die for my sins, grant me forgiveness for all of them. Thus I may no longer feel the burden of my sins, a burden that oppresses me beyond measure. Assist me, dear Jesus, for I desire to become good no matter what the cost. Take away, destroy, and utterly root out whatever you find in me that is contrary to your holy will. At the same time, dear Jesus, illumine me so that I may walk in your holy light. Amen. So in this next pericope, Moses takes the mission from the Lord. He goes back to Midian and Jethro. He asks to leave because the Pharaoh and any of those who remember him are now long dead and gone. Jethro says yes. The Lord tells Moses this will not be easy because Pharaoh is going to say no. There's a very obscure scene with Zipporah and Gershom. Moses meets up with his brother Aaron, and then they head back to Egypt. So we're going to pick it up here, take a look at chapter 4, verse 18 to 31. Okay, in the literal sense, it's interesting that Moses does not seem to trust Jethro with the details. He says he's going back to Egypt to see whether his antagonists are gone, but he does not share the details that he has a mission from God that he sent to go free his people. That's interesting. Moses gets the blessing of his father-in-law, and verse 20 says, he and Zipporah and the sons, plural. So far we've only been introduced to one son, Gershom. We're going to see in chapter 18, a very long time from now, there is a second son, Eleazar. We'll meet him a little bit later. But now the Lord tells Moses, Pharaoh is going to be very difficult. We're going to see this text note on chapter 4, verse 21, about hardening the heart of Pharaoh. It's a recurring theme in the upcoming plague narratives. In the course of the first 5 plagues and beyond, Pharaoh hardens his own heart by refusing the demands of the Lord. Beginning with the 6th plague, however, it is said that God hardens Pharaoh's heart and makes him unresponsive to the warnings of Moses. And as much as Pharaoh hardens his own heart before God is said to intervene, we see that Pharaoh is no innocent victim. He's not a pawn manipulated by higher power. He has opposed the Lord's plan from the very beginning. And 2, divine hardening is a response to human stubbornness. It's not the initial cause of it. Most likely, divine hardening is a metaphor to describe the withdrawal of God's mercy and grace from the sinner. And now remember, so far in Exodus, the Pharaoh has not really been depicted in a very great light. This Pharaoh's predecessor was duped by a couple of midwives who helped the Hebrew boy escape, right? The boy was taken into Pharaoh's own home, right under his own nose, by another woman who contradicted the Pharaoh, his own daughter, right? Pharaoh may have even cursed his own children. It's something that I discovered after we looked at chapter 1. I saw this afterwards. Pharaoh commanded that the firstborn sons be killed in chapter 1, verse 22. 122 says, Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. It's interesting that in most scrolls found on this chapter in different languages, they do not include the phrase of the Hebrews. So he doesn't specify the killing of the firstborn Hebrews. He accidentally, stupidly, curses the firstborn of all the families in Egypt. You can be sure that some Jewish rabbis have had a field day with how ignorant that Pharaoh must be. Now here's a little aside about text notes in your Bible. You may notice that there's a text note about this particular verse. The text notes sometimes say MSS. Those are Masoretic texts, the historical Hebrew canon. So those are manuscripts that we find in the Hebrew language. SAM are Samaritan texts. GK are Greek texts. TG are Targums for that ancient Aramaic text that uses the Targums or the Maturgamons, right, that we mentioned a couple episodes ago. VG is the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation, the Vulgate. LXX is the Greek Septuagint, so the Greek translation. So sometimes in your text notes you might see those letters, and that's what it represents. The text note in the New Ignatius Study Bible shows us this phrase, to the Hebrews, is lacking in the Samaritan, the Greek, and the Aramaic languages. So it's probably only found in the Masoretic Hebrew text. So anyway, God calls Israel my firstborn son. Wow, this is huge. It's a major theme of Exodus. It's a major theme of all of the Bible. I want to take a look at the text note. 4:22, my firstborn son, Israel's national identity in relationship to Yahweh, the adoptive sonship of the chosen people, is rooted in God's covenant with the patriarchs and their descendants. It is a collective prerogative that belongs to the nation. Designated the Lord's firstborn, Israel is marked out as the first recipient of divine redemption among the family of nations. Implied in this relationship is the fact that God has a tender love for Israel, that Israel's election is the result of God's gratuitous initiative, and that Israel has the privilege of a son in serving Yahweh, the divine Father. Now, let's also look at page 14 of the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible. It talks about the major themes of the book of Exodus. If you take a look at page 14, the themes, it mentions the two themes of liberation and legislation. I would add firstborn son as one of the major themes, as well as the theme of obedience. So I would say there's four major themes in Exodus. Israel is my firstborn son, liberation, legislation, and the fourth major theme is obedience. In the ancient world, and certainly in Israel, the firstborn son received a double portion of the inheritance. He was considered the favorite one of God in the family. Along with the extra helping of the inheritance, though, the firstborn also has extra responsibility to take care of the younger siblings, especially any girls. Israel is not God's one and only son. There is a sense in which all people in all nations of the world are the sons of God. But because Israel is favored by God and chosen to be his special people, by the Jewish definition, Israel was God's chosen firstborn son. Later we're going to see that God calls the Israelites to be a holy nation, set apart, a nation of priests. As a nation of priests, their role is to serve as intercessors, as ones who sacrifice for all the others. But Israel will fail. They can't handle it. We're going to see that right here in Exodus. They are called to bring God to the world, and they mess it up. So Jesus comes, and Jesus does not fail. Then there is this really strange paragraph which most commentaries will say things like, this is obscure, this is difficult, this is uncertain, puzzling, even bizarre, right? This is one of those, shall we say, troubling scenes of the Old Testament. We'll spend some time with this right now, so settle in for a few minutes. First, as always, when unsure, take it to prayer. Ask God what he can make out of this for us. Ask God to explain it. Ask him to help you understand how to apply it. And it can be applied. We're going to reread verse 24 to 26. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. Then it was that she said, "You are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." Well, in the Hebrew of this pericope, there are so many pronouns and nondescriptive nouns it makes it very, very confusing. Moses' name is never actually mentioned in the pericope. It's always just he. The he, though, also refers to God and also refers to Gershom, Moses' son. So this is where some of the confusion plays in. The Lord met him and sought to kill him, it says in verse 24. That's a Jewish expression. It means something like someone grew very ill. Since ancient Israelites especially assumed that God controlled absolutely everything, he was the first cause of everything. They even assumed that God caused the bad things that happened in the world in one way or another. Now, we see that evil and bad things come in a little different light. As Christians, we see it a little differently. There's a slow revelation and an understanding of the loving Father and God's passive will in allowing bad things to happen for a better outcome. As Christians, as we see it, God never causes bad things or suffering. They're caused by sin and rebellion and the free will of people, and sort of in a sense, sometimes the free will of nature, so to speak. But God allows bad things to happen because they serve a greater purpose. So who is the he? So it says the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Who is the he? Gershom or Moses? Most commentators say that it appears that Moses grew very ill. Well, why? What did he do wrong? Zipporah, again, a woman, saves the day. It appears she performs a circumcision on the son with the flint knife. That much we know for sure. It literally says that. But then it says, oddly, she touched his feet with it. Well, whose feet with what? Gershom or Moses' feet? And what is it? He touched it to the feet. The flint or the bloody foreskin? Some say that Zipporah touched her son with his own bloody foreskin. Others say she touched Moses with the bloody foreskin. Now, how weird is this? Others say, no, she touched Moses with the flint knife. Okay, now how do we make sense of all this? The early church fathers see this as covenantal and allegorical. I'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the other spiritual senses. Some commentators that rely very heavily on source criticism say that this whole scene is an ancient pagan story that Exodus editors just kind of rolled in. They say it's a commonly known story of another god of some kind who wanted a bloody sacrifice and was only appeased when the blood was offered. They see some sort of strange ritual where Gershom's blood is put at the feet of his dad and the god is pleased. I suppose they think that the redactors and the editors rolled the story into Exodus and into this drama as some sort of foreshadowing of the Passover, the blood sacrifice that's about to come. But doesn't that just seem a little strange that Jewish editors would include a pagan story of a bloodthirsty God that has nothing to do with our God? Even if they were just editing in some kind of popular story of the day, why would they insert this? Most rabbinical sources that I looked at would say for sure it looks like Gershom had not yet been circumcised. Let's take a look at the text note in the study Bible. It says the original meaning is obscure. Once again, Moses may have followed the Midianite custom of waiting to circumcise boys until just before marriage. If so, he neglected the Abrahamic covenant, which required newborn males to be circumcised on the 8th day after birth. This comes in Genesis 17. Failure to observe this rite meant being cut off from the covenant people. In any case, the incident is often thought to foreshadow the events of Passover. Consider the fact that 1, the present episode directly follows a reference in chapter 4, verse 23, to the 10th plague. 2, the stopover at a lodging at night, it suggests this is a nighttime setting, like the Passover happened at night. 3, the death is averted by a ritual shedding of blood, which will happen with the Passover. And 4, the expression sought to kill him in 4:24 may refer not to the Lord's pursuit of Moses, but to a divine threat against Gershom, who is the firstborn son of Moses. I look at that and I think, I'm not satisfied with that. Something is still missing. Something's off. This still doesn't fit. Look at the way it fits with the whole scripture story. I mentioned last week that canonical exegesis is the interpretation that takes what's actually said and it sees it in view of the whole Bible story, the whole canon. Also, this is a great tip in scripture anytime we're reading something. Look in the rear view mirror and clean off the windshield right ahead of you. In other words, what does the text say that we just came from? And where are we headed? What's the context of what's about to happen? The line before, in verse 23, the Lord gives Moses these words to say to Pharaoh, "Let my son," which we just learned is the nation of Israel, right? "Let my son, Israel, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your firstborn son." So coming out of these lines, it seems to be pointing ahead to the bloody sacrifice of the Passover, where the firstborn son of Pharaoh will be taken and the nation is saved through a blood covenant. But now we come to Moses and we come to Zipporah, and a mention of their firstborn son is linked to the covenant as well. So the covenant of Passover with Moses and the covenant of circumcision has everything to do with this. They appear to be linked with blood. It appears to be that Gershom was not yet circumcised. That seems pretty clear. He was not brought into the covenant family properly as was expected all the way back in Genesis. But I still don't understand part of this. Key to what is confusion is that it mentions the feet. Something about putting this bloody offering at the feet. Well, the thing is, the feet is not really feet. His feet is sort of a Jewish euphemism for his private parts, that which is between the feet. Sort of a nice way that Israelites talked about private parts. Besides, what does that have to do with anything if it's feet anyway, right? So I suppose in order for this to really make sense, we have to really talk about the whole issue of circumcision and that covenant. What a weird way to show that you belong to God's family, right? Well, no, not really. God tells Abraham about the covenant of circumcision in Genesis chapter 17, right after Abraham and Sarah messed up their family plan. God told them to hang tight and to wait and that they would have a child, but they didn't listen to God. They tried to have a child using Hagar, a slave girl. She bore a son named Ishmael. God did not approve of this, and he never told them to do this. So after the misuse of his fatherhood and fertility, God asks for a sign of his covenant, his lifelong promise with Abraham. Old Abe got to demonstrate his trust by literally giving God a sacrifice of his fatherhood and his fertility. You get that? He quite literally gave to God, he surrendered to God in blood his creative, regenerative power, and he's consecrating the very source of new human life to God. Do you get that? That's what circumcision is really about. So, what a sign. As Christians, our initiation into the covenant community is baptism, and it's for men and women. For Israel, it's a Jewish man that this initiation of cutting off part of this most private part, right? And that's the sign. That is to be a sign. It is to be done on the 8th day after birth, sort of like a lifelong reminder that God has asked us to be fruitful and to multiply. A lifelong reminder that God has asked for our fertility to be used according to his plan. So anyway, it appears that the son has not formally joined the covenant family. Genesis 17:14 has God telling Abraham that any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his own people. He has broken my covenant. So that's what it said back in Genesis. So now ahead in Exodus 4, it says that the Lord met him and sought to kill him, probably meaning he got very ill. And he and Zipporah said, "Oi, maybe we need to circumcise the boy," right? Okay, simple enough. But which one is it? Which one did the Lord seek to kill? Moses or Gershom? By the rest of the pericope, it looks like we're talking about Gershom. But what about this business about touching something and someone, and then Moses is a groom of blood? And I thought it's about Gershom. I thought it's about the boy. So why is Moses, the groom to Zipporah, mentioned as a groom of blood? I struggled with this for a really long while. In the past, I never really read anything that I liked, that I came upon, until, I found it. Something that satisfied me. The Navarre commentary led me on a little bit of a search with some rabbinical writings that suggest Moses himself may not have yet been circumcised. In Exodus 2, it tells us that Moses was born with no mention of his mama or his papa bringing him into the covenant. There are targums of Exodus that bracket a shorter version of this scene with a backstory of Moses being circumcised. It's a little vague as to whether he was circumcised as an infant or whether it was later in his adulthood, but the Targums insert that story here. Now, most other scrolls don't have that backstory. They just tell the scene sort of like this. Think this through. If Moses had not yet been circumcised himself, then what it could be saying is that after circumcising the boy Gershom, Zipporah touches Moses with the flint, meaning she also cut him with the flint, with the knife, and she cut his feet, or that which is between his feet. Then, at least for me, this whole scene makes more sense. For some reason, though, it was Zipporah. Remember, she's not even Hebrew, she's a Midianite. But she's the one who recognized that the covenant sign had to be completed. And that's often a theme in the Bible, that Gentiles and outsiders remind God's people who they are and who they are called to be and what they're supposed to do. Well, now Moses is ready for his mission. He's truly united in the covenant with his own people. He is truly a groom of blood, a groom united to his bride through the sacrifice and through his offering. And again, he's a type for Jesus, who is a groom of blood for us, for the church, and for Israel. Jesus shed his blood for us. He is the bridegroom. Here, it appears, Moses shed his blood. Whew. Wow, that was a lot. All right, so sit with this a bit. Revisit this a little bit. It doesn't have to be the explanation, but in my little mind, this makes the most sense. And I did find some stuff, and I did find some things that supported it. Okay, now back to the text. Where has Aaron been? We're not told. But Moses explains to Aaron while they meet at Mount Horeb. Again, he goes all the way back to the mountain, to the peaks where God is seen most often in the Old Testament. They go all the way back to Egypt, and he explains to the people what the plan is. Now, from some notes in the book of Numbers, it looks like the journey from Mount Horeb all the way back to Egypt was between a month and a half journey, between 31 and 47 days. So when Moses tells the elders who are back in enslavement in Egypt, everyone is pretty darn excited with these signs, right? When he tells them that, this is quite a huge adventure going back and forth between the two. All right, now let's look at allegory. Remember, as we study Exodus, Moses is pointing always to Jesus. He's a type for the saving mission of Christ. St. Matthew presents Jesus as the new Moses in his gospel, as Matthew is writing to the Jews. In verse 19, the Lord says, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead." This is paraphrased in the Gospel of Matthew, where the angel tells Joseph, "Rise and take the child and his mother and go back to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." It's almost the same thing, except they're going in opposite directions for the same reason. Now remember, St. Matthew would have known this story in Exodus very well. That's one of the exciting thoughts as we read through this. Jesus and the apostles and the saints all through history, they all knew these same passages. We're studying the same words that they studied. Well, we're looking at it in English, but you know what I mean. So where Moses was going to go back to Egypt because the people that sought him were dead, the Holy Family are going to leave Egypt and go back to the Holy Land because the people that sought them are dead. Now God says Israel is his firstborn son. Israel is both the nation and Israel is the person, Jacob, who gets his name changed to Israel. And both Israel and Israel, the man and the nation, are types for Jesus on one hand. Jesus will relive much of the experience and retrace many of the steps that happened to the Israelites. He will undo much of the division that takes place within Israel. He will not fail where Israel did fail in becoming the nation of priests and holy people. So Israel also is a sign. Israel itself is a type for Christ as well for all of us. Israel is a type for the church. Israel points forward to the church. Now in that strange scene with the flint knife and Moses' feet, and blood is always a symbolic type that points towards Jesus. He is our groom in blood. He is called the groom to the bride of the church, right? Also, there's a Jewish understanding of circumcision that it was the entry into the covenant with Yahweh. For Christians, the entry into the covenant is baptism. So here, Moses is making sure his family is part of the covenant community, including himself. He's making sure that they have entered fully into the community before he sets out on mission. This scene looks forward just a short time later as a type of Passover. And we already talked about how it involves the firstborn, there's a shedding of blood, there's ritual, there's salvation, it takes place overnight. So this scene is kind of looking forward to the Passover, and the Passover is greatly looking forward to Jesus. And now this whole scene makes a whole lot more sense to me. Moses and Aaron meet at Horeb, the mountain of the Lord, in the midst of the wilderness. Now remember, Horeb and Sinai seem to be somewhat used interchangeably. Horeb and Sinai may be just different hills or peaks of the same mountain range. There's a lot of argument among scholars and travel agencies that lead pilgrimages just exactly where these mountain peaks really are today. But Origen, who's an ancient church father, he mentions the mountain peak where Jesus will meet with Moses and Elijah, not this specific mountain, another mountain in the Holy Land, but a mountain in general. God tends to meet his people on the mountain. Now for the action sense. Remember, in these days, travel was life-threatening and extremely difficult. Every time Moses crosses the continent, this is a journey. It's a trek through mountains and desert. Surely there were simple roads cut through the terrain, simply from trampled down ground, but there'd be nothing like even our worst dirt roads here in America. These would be vague hiking trails, if they're even marked at all. Recognize what a chore and what a trial it is every time there's a little sentence that just seems like a throwaway. They went back to Egypt. They went back to the wilderness, right? This is a major adventure and a major decision every single time they go upon that journey. I want you to get the impending sense of courage and faith that Moses is building up here. He's about to face off with Pharaoh. He's the most powerful king in the known world at that time. And with the people that Moses has a past with, right? He understands what he is facing. He's about to tell Pharaoh, who believes that he's a god himself, that he's divinely chosen to sit on the throne, that no, sorry Pharaoh, you are not the one chosen by God to be a son, right? Rather, this ragtag ethnic group of slaves, they're the chosen ones. They are the firstborn. They are the special ones. That's going to take a lot of chutzpah, right? Moses is showing us throughout this book, despite his hesitations and questions, that he has an amazing sense of courage and faith. It's a major lesson in moral action. Now the application sense. Notice that God and Moses are in regular communication. There's an ongoing prayer. There's ongoing connection. In prayer, we need to listen to the voice of God, and when we spend some time with him, we start to recognize his voice and discern whether this is the Lord talking to us or another voice, or our own voice, or the voice of the enemy, the voice of the world. Moses is clear that he's listening to the voice of Yahweh, and he moves with action. That's really important to catch. Now, when we talk about Israel being the firstborn of God, we usually spend our time focusing on the son. But what this shows us is the fatherhood of God. He is not just a cold creator artist who creates for his own pleasure. He's not just a hard-nosed judge that's waiting for little people to break rules so he can punish them. He is a father, a loving, creative, merciful, will do anything for my kids kind of father. Throughout Exodus, God hardens Pharaoh's heart. Some commentaries say it's 9 times, and then Pharaoh hardens his own heart 10 times. Different translations differ a little. Some have 9 and 9, some have 10 and 10. It depends on whether they draw from the Masorite, the Targum, or the Greek. Remember those words that we just talked about? But as the note mentioned earlier, God's hardening of someone's heart is more of an allowance. You want to be hard-hearted? Okay, I'll let you be. God does not take away free will. He does not force someone to be sinful or evil or wicked. One thought that I learned very early on in my Christian journey is that the heat of the sun can make wax melt, and that same sun can make clay harden. In the heat, the same light of God's love and mercy and grace, we can either melt or we can harden. Are we more like wax or are we more like clay? That decision is ours. The reaction takes place because of our heart condition. Amen? God reminds Moses that he has put the miracles into the hands of Moses. It is the Lord's power. So I want you to think of Jesus and the vine and the branches. Jesus says, without me, you can do nothing. We must stay connected to our spiritual sources. We must stay attached to the vine. Moses is surely connected to God. Now, in that strange scene with the flint knife and the circumcision, whatever exactly the details are, it appears that God is giving us the importance of covenantal promises, no matter how we look at it. Do we willingly ignore them, or do we accidentally overlook them sometimes? The promises of the covenants have been given to us out of importance. They have terrific meaning. When we Christians are called by God to enter into baptism and reception of the Eucharist and to confession, we have precepts and expectations on our end to maintain our participation in the covenant. We need to assess ourselves frequently. St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, some Christians are sick and ill because they present themselves to the Eucharist unworthily. They step up to renew their covenantal bond by receiving the Eucharist, and they don't really mean it. Wow, is that us? Do you have a regular examination of conscience or a daily examine prayer where you look back and you ask yourself, am I really doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I responding to this amazing love and mercy that God has shown me? Am I purposefully avoiding, or am I neglectful? Am I sliding? Am I floating slowly away from my responsibilities just because I'm lazy, or because I'm scared, or because I hurt, or because I don't trust? As strange as this little scene may be, I want you to ponder your deliberateness in your reaction to God. This has really made me think a lot. This little scene has been the source of a lot of meditation for me lately. Origen reminds us that we must all climb the mountain to meet with God. If you do not attain the heights of spiritual knowledge, the Lord will be unable to open your mouth, he says. That seems pretty straightforward. He wants us to climb the mountain. Amen? Now, onward. Chapter 5 is not loaded with a lot of theology. It's not very difficult. There's not a lot of allusions or allegory. Chapter 5 is simply really good storytelling. I'm going to set it up, and then I'm going to have you read it before we meet next time. We'll pick up with chapter 6. So after Moses meets with Aaron, they return to Egypt and they tell the people the plan. Everyone's excited. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh. They say, let my people go. Pharaoh says, who's the Lord? I don't even know him. Indeed, he does not. Pharaoh decides, well, if the Hebrew slaves have enough time on their hands to go away and rest, then they have enough time to work even harder, right? Well, to rest is to Shabbat. It's the word Shabbat, Sabbath. To rest is to Sabbath. The Sabbath day is meant as a day of rest. To Shabbat, to cease, to stop. Let God be God. We rest in his presence for a day. So Pharaoh makes their tasks even more difficult by not even providing the basic straw needed to produce the giant blocks used in the building projects. The overseers double down on the Hebrews. They are not pleased with Moses. And the people start to blame Moses. And Moses laments, and get used to this scene, because for the next 40 years, this is going to happen over and over again to Moses. This looks like things were better, to bad, to much, much, much worse. Imagine what Moses is thinking about himself, about his situation, about God. But God has a plan. God is working. God is moving. It doesn't look like it on the surface. He's calling Moses and the people into obedience and into faithfulness, just like he calls us. Like Jeremiah the prophet, who does exactly what the Lord tells him to do, and it looks like total failure. Israel falls. Jeremiah gets taken away into captivity. Talk about disappointment. Talk about confusion. Talk about loss of hope. But God tells Moses, Pharaoh will not believe. He told Moses this. It shouldn't be a surprise. Again, remember, God wants them to abide. To serve and worship is the same word in Hebrew. You know, we kind of do that in English too. A worship service, the Good Friday service. The irony is that a major theme here in Exodus is if you abide with God, or if you abide with Pharaoh, that worship or that work or that service kind of takes on a really different meaning. God is calling them to abide. The scene is calling us to be obedient and faithful even in what looks like hopeless situations, situations getting worse and worse. Disappointment in our work must not drive us from God. If we do face major disappointment or despair, we have to ask, on our part, is there something half-hearted? Did we do something wrong? Do we really believe, or are we really doubting right now? There's something in us that's almost like looking for things to fail sometimes so that we can say, oh, I knew it. God, you just keep saying that you love me. You keep saying I need to trust you. But in this situation, I'm not seeing it. Sometimes we're almost looking for a way to blame God. And this whole book, all of Exodus, is demonstrating the power of God, grace, mercy, action, signs, God's work through suffering, God's work through long trials. God's going to work through a yes, through obedience. And the more obedience we give, the more grace is going to be amplified. Do you get that? The more we say yes, and the more we participate, and the more we enter, and the more he follows, the more he gives. So in our struggles, hold on to those high points. Hold on to the word, the signs, the flaming bush. In that current crisis, in those immediate frustrations, don't forget the faithfulness of God. This is for all of us. It's not just for Moses, for all of us. Have gratitude. Remember the signs. Remember the answered prayers. Remember that he spoke to us. The reality is we will have disappointment. How real is life that looks good and then it goes bad? Right? How real is this life that has disappointment and loss of hope? Reality just like smacks us in the face sometimes, and it really hurts. Reality is that sometimes when you're in the middle of suffering, we don't even want to hear about God's love and mercy and yada, 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 yada. Sometimes we can't hear it. It's not the right time. But this painful experience of life, this is what teaches us patience. You know, even in slave labor camps and execution camps and concentration camps, we hear stories about Christians and Jews and folks of other faith even who found joy and purpose and meaning in the face of the worst possible situations. Corrie ten Boom, Father Maximilian Kolbe, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, brothers and sisters today in China and in North Korea and in Africa and in the Middle East, even if he does not save them in the way they think and they hope for, they still worship and love him. So many people have learned this secret of faithfulness, of obedience, of patience. So when we despair and when we give in, that's a warning light to look at. It sometimes shows us where our heart and where our hope really lie. I really want you to ponder this as you read the next full chapter, chapter 5 of the book of Exodus. And we'll wrap up this week's session. You're going to end with reading chapter 5, and we'll pick up next week. I can't wait to see you again. All glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Read chapter 5. See you next week.
Thanks for walking the way through the book of Exodus with the Catholic Community Scripture Study.